Stormfront, Book 2 in the God in Black series by Rodney Hamright and Suda Wright, 5 years after God Almighty's first appearance as a black man with dreadlocks, name Emmanuel. His teachings has ignited a cultural upheaval in America. Black churches flourish as they embrace his message of love and unity, drawing multiracial congregations and leading many people to abandon traditional white denominations. Emmanuel continues to appear spontaneously in small towns across the country, spreading his message before vanishing as mysteriously as he arrived. His presence and acceptance of his teachings provoke anxiety among white church leaders and politicians. They fear that if Emmanuel's influence grows, it will lead to widespread demands for the government to end its discriminatory practices against black and brown communities. Get it at rodneyhamrightbooks.com and Amazon, Audible and iTunes, or listen on Apple Podcast.
Chapter 1. A Nation Transformed. Storm 1. At 10 minutes to 11, Marcus Whitfield stood behind the pulpit of New Jerusalem Tabernacle and watched the light move. Sun through the stained glass windows bled across his hands, dappling the knuckles with wild colors, crimson and indigo, and a sickly, ironic shade of white that always made him think of hospital lights on old wounds. The wood of the pulpit was cool and familiar beneath his palms, his fingerprints worn smooth against the lacquered edge. He allowed himself a breath before the next line. The congregation was packed, from the first pew to the folding chairs against the back wall, shoulder to shoulder, almost swaying with their anticipation. There was the old heat of bodies and the new, nervous energy of the outsider. Black faces, of course, outnumbered the rest. This was the South, and this was Sunday morning. But more and more, Marcus noted the others. A mother with blonde hair fanning her infant with the program, a red-headed teacher from the middle school sitting beside her husband, and their ambiguous child, a Korean family who always arrived late and sat near the exit, nodding politely but not singing. These were the refugees of other churches, or at least that's what Marcus called them, the ones who'd left their own sanctuaries for reasons spoken and not. He called them by name when he prayed at night, though never from the pulpit. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was soft as felt and just as dense. Brothers and sisters, he began, and let the words ring. We are gathered here, not as strangers, not as adversaries, but as family in the truest sense, a family that transcends blood and race and the crooked boundaries set by men. There was a low, rolling murmur from the crowd, a few amens loosed by the loyalists. It pleased Marcus, but he kept his face neutral, controlled. The rhythm of the service was everything. Too much, too soon, and you lost them before the end. Today, he continued, letting his fingers trace the edge of the pulpit, I want to talk about what it means to be remade, not simply forgiveness. Forgiveness is an act, a moment. Remaking is a process, and it hurts. He paused, eyes scanning the aisle, catching the pain in the faces that listened, the bruised and the hopeful alike. Ask yourselves, what is your wound? What is the old scar you cover up before you leave the house? The thing you would rather the world not see? Now the sound built, a percussive shuffling of hymnals and coughs, the scrape of a folding chair as someone leaned forward. There was the scent of old perfume, white diamonds, Marcus guessed, and a spike of aftershave that stung the air. He remembered his own father in that moment, stoic in the third pew, with hands clasped and head down, never looking up even when Marcus spoke his name. The memory of his father's discipline and his mother's silence coiled around his words, made them heavy. He pressed on. Emmanuel Bishop teaches us that unity is not sameness. Unity is the wild tangle of difference, woven together by something greater than doctrine, greater than the flag, greater than the memory of what was done to us or by us. A woman in the fourth pew. Miss Lila, hair wound tight as a crown, raised her hand in the air and let out a sharp, triumphant shout. Marcus nodded in her direction. He saw tears on her cheeks, as bright as the glass on the windows. It occurred to him then that the room had gone unusually still, the children subdued, the elders alert. Even the skeptical newcomers were listening, eyes fixed on him, and not on their feet or the doors. Unity, Marcus said, is the act of forgiving even those who have not asked. It is loving the stranger, yes, but harder still, loving the enemy. And sometimes, the enemy looks a lot like us. His voice caught a stumble that would have embarrassed him once. He glanced at the front row where Deacon Smith, all 6 feet of him, sat with arms folded and a look that bordered on skepticism. Marcus knew this was the hardest part. He remembered the faculty lounge at the seminary, the way colleagues had looked through him when he quoted liberation theology, their smiles tight and their eyes averted. He remembered the slow humiliation of tenure denied, the laughter that followed him down the corridor after the bishop's first televised sermon. He felt again the humiliation of being both too black and not black enough, of being the voice of the unpalatable in rooms that wanted only pleasant noises. He took a breath, then 2, and let the silence stretch until it threatened to snap. The world, he said quietly, will try to unmake you every day. It will remind you of the old wound. It will pit you against your brother, your sister, and your neighbor. But we are not made to hate, my friends. We are made to heal. The choir stirred behind him, a restless susurration of silks and cotton and the faint, peppermint breath of Mrs. Green, the alto. Marcus could feel the anticipation in their eyes, waiting for his signal. Instead, he leaned forward, drawing the crowd in with a conspiratorial hush. Last night, I sat with a man who told me, "Pastor, I can forgive the white man, but I cannot forgive myself." He said it as if it was a confession, a weakness. But what I told him is what I will tell you now. Redemption is not a prize for the perfect. It is for the broken, the angry, the bitter. It is for those of us who remember too well and those of us who would rather forget. This time, the response was louder, a syncopated chorus of agreement, rising and falling with the cadence of his words. He saw arms lift in spontaneous worship, hands shaking as they caught the current. He felt a tightness behind his own ribs, an old resentment straining to be heard, but he pressed it down. Emmanuel Bishop walks among us, not as a judge, but as a witness. His message is not about punishment, but possibility. Each of us are living proof that wounds can heal, that enemies can eat at the same table, that a people divided for centuries can sing with one voice. He paused again, letting the congregation absorb it. There was a distant, deliberate sniffle from the rear. Marcus glanced out at the crowd, catching a boy in a pressed shirt and clip-on tie, staring up with a mixture of hope and suspicion. It reminded Marcus of himself at that age, back when church was still a place of dread and forced smiles. In this house, Marcus said, "We do not ignore what has been done. We do not paper over history or pretend the past never happened. But we refuse to be defined by it. We choose every day to be remade in the image of grace." Now the noise was a wave. People stood in the aisles, hands clasped over heads, some swaying with eyes shut. A woman 3 rows back let out a guttural cry, and Marcus felt the tears prick at the corners of his own eyes, unwelcome but real. He let the moment build. He reached under the pulpit, took up the battered black Bible that had belonged to his grandmother, and raised it high. "Turn with me," he said, "to the book of Ephesians." There was a flurry of motion, the sound of pages rustling, and the soft, insistent whispers of people reciting the verse from memory. He waited until the voices settled, until the crowd was hungry for the next word. Ephesians 2:14, "For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us." He read it slowly, letting every word settle. "We are one, because we have been broken together," he said. "We are one, because the wall that kept us apart is shattered. All that remains now is what we build in its place." The choir began softly at first, then stronger. Voices braided together in a tune older than the brick and plaster of the building. Marcus stood back and let it happen, his eyes on the fractured sunlight, watching the mingled colors blur and running down the whitewashed walls. He thought, as he always did, of the old seminary and the empty classrooms, of his father's unyielding silence and his mother's trembling hands. He thought of the man who had once called him boy in a crowded staff meeting, of the way forgiveness sometimes tasted like blood in the mouth. And then he looked out at the room, the new America, the beautiful mess of it, and he wondered if, maybe, this was what redemption really looked like. Not perfect, but possible. As the last verse faded, and the congregation began to gather their coats and babies, Marcus remained at the pulpit, hands still on the wood, head bowed. For a moment, just a moment, he let himself believe that unity was more than a word, that the wounds, both new and old, might one day be just scars. Storm 2. By the time Marcus unlocked the side door and stepped out into the narrow alley behind the sanctuary, the parking lot was already in full retreat. The latecomers, still flush from the altar call, walked arm in arm to their cars, carrying the last strains of the choir's benediction, like invisible banners. Every space was filled, right up to the ragged grass beyond the lot's cracked asphalt. It looked, to Marcus, like the exodus after a sold-out ball game. He paused on the stoop and watched a father in an old Camry buckle his twin daughters into booster seats, their hair tied with matching ribbons. Next to the Camry was an Escalade, gleaming and new, the type of car Marcus had once associated with pharmaceutical reps and certain kinds of politicians. Down the line, a hatchback bore 3 bumper stickers, Coexist, in rainbow font, a faded, "My child is an honor student at Central Middle," and, most recently, "Have you hugged your neighbor today?" The lot was a museum of American hope and exhaustion, the badges of family, faith, and failed progress lined up in uneasy harmony. Across the street, the lot at Grace Methodist was as empty as a closed library. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the lonely Volvo parked under a dying oak, waiting for no one. The sun glared off the lines of vacant concrete, and above the empty entrance, a tattered banner hung. All are welcome. Join us Sundays at 10 a.m. The lie of it made Marcus smile, but only for a second. He walked the sidewalk, scanning for the other markers of the new era. In every direction, the signs were obvious. 5 years had passed since Emmanuel Bishop first appeared on the news, and in those years, the boundaries between churches had liquefied, pooled, and finally burst. The old racial divides, the stubborn, invisible lines of ours and theirs, had begun to dissolve, and with them, the authority of the white pulpits. Some had merged out of necessity, sharing pastors or choirs. Others had gone dark, the congregations atomized, drifting to new homes or nowhere at all. Marcus found himself at the edge of a field that, until recently, had belonged to First Baptist. The church itself was locked up tight, the signboard out front weathered and illegible, the grass gone wild around the foundations. Only the parking lot remained, a vast, silent slab of potential, marked with peeling paint and the scattered debris of old sermons, communion cups, a half-shredded palm frond, a crushed styrofoam coffee cup. He wasn't alone. From the shadow of the vestibule, a lone janitor swept the steps with a stiff, bristled broom. He worked in slow, deliberate arcs, the kind of motion that suggested no one was paying him by the hour. Every so often, the man would stop and look up, eyes tracking the distant movement of cars and people at Marcus's church. He never waved, never called out, just watched with the deep patience of someone who had seen enough to know how things end. Marcus lingered, unsure whether to approach or move on. In another life, he might have pitied the man. Today, he simply nodded, an acknowledgement between two survivors. The janitor nodded back, his mouth set in a line that didn't quite resolve into a smile or a frown. He returned to his sweeping, and Marcus continued down the block. He took the long way around, past the faded brick of St. Luke's and the cinder block bunker of New Faith Missionary. He counted 7 other empty churches before he circled back to his own. Each one told the same story, the story of a country that had spent centuries building walls, only to find them suddenly gone. What replaced them, Marcus thought, was still up for debate. He reached the edge of New Jerusalem's lot and paused to take it all in. The children played tag around the bell tower, their laughter ricocheting off the cars and onto the street. Teenagers huddled near the food truck that now parked out front every Sunday, picking at hot wings and wiping orange dust on their jeans. Elders walked slowly, arm in arm, trading stories and gossip in the shade of the crepe myrtles. The air shimmered with sweat and joy, and something that felt, to Marcus, like hope. He remembered the first time he'd seen Emmanuel Bishop in person. A park, seated on a weathered wooden bench, the man's presence somehow resonated deeper than the chatter of nearby children, the scent of blooming flowers. Marcus had watched him speak to the crowd, watched black and white and every shade in between rise up together, hands joined in the damp summer air. In that moment, the old wounds didn't matter. Only the possibility of healing did. Now, 5 years later, Marcus looked at his church and saw the proof. Not perfect, but possible. A unity born, not of assurance, but of the stubborn insistence on coexistence. Across the street, the janitor swept the same patch of sidewalk, pausing every few minutes to look up at the commotion. The empty churches loomed behind him, monuments to a faith that had failed to keep pace with the people it claimed to serve. Marcus turned away, leaving the field and the janitor and the empty lots behind. In his chest, a familiar ache flared, a wound maybe, but also a reminder. Some walls fall with a crash, others with a sigh, and some you never notice until you're on the other side. He walked back toward the noise and the crowd, the living church, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, America could be remade too. Storm 3. The air conditioning in the sedan was losing its battle against the Virginia heat, but Catherine Thorne refused to sweat. She sat perfectly upright behind the wheel, her suit jacket buttoned and her blouse pressed, as if defiance of the elements might itself become a virtue. Her hair, gray and tightly wound, showed not a single stray strand. Every minute or so, she would adjust her wire-rimmed glasses, not to correct her vision, which was surgically perfect, but to remind herself that her role here was observation, not participation. Through the tinted window, Catherine watched the crowd spill from the front doors of New Jerusalem Tabernacle. The congregation was larger than she remembered from her last visit, and more colorful in every sense. She reached for her notebook, a battered leather thing, marked at the edges with the oils of 1,000 anxious hands, and scribbled a quick notation. 180 plus post service, multi-ethnic, strong cohesion, see photo. She underlined the last part, then placed the notebook back on the seat beside her, where it nestled against a file folder stamped Cultural Impact Assessment, Emmanuel Bishop, Auma. The street outside throbbed with the sound of mingling voices, a living stream of humanity. Catherine's eye, trained for patterns and anomalies, found both in equal measure. There was a black man in a Lakers jersey, sharing a joke with a Latina grandmother, a pair of white teenage boys trading high fives with a biracial girl in a floral dress, a Southeast Asian mother herding her children toward a battered minivan, while a trio of older black women clucked their approval. The boundaries she remembered from her own childhood, the quiet, invisible lines of color and class, had gone blurry here, like a photo pulled out of focus. Catherine's lips thinned. She reached for her government-issued phone, unlocked the encrypted Notes app, and began dictating in clipped, precise tones. Sunday, 11:32 a.m. New Jerusalem congregation dispersing. Notable increase in white and mixed race attendance. Interpersonal behaviors. High trust. High effect. Several instances of cross-racial physical contact, including hugs and handshakes. Atmosphere. Celebratory. Almost festive. Possible intervention points limited at this time. She clicked the phone off and set it carefully atop her lap. For a moment, she allowed herself the indulgence of memory. Her brother's funeral, the hard-edged solemnity of St. Mark's, the sea of white faces, all turned toward the closed casket. Her mother's hands folded in her lap, trembling just enough to betray her. Catherine had sworn, that day, never to let emotion cloud her judgment. She'd kept her promise for 30 years. Emotion in the corner of her eye brought her back. Marcus Whitfield, tall and unmistakable in his crisp shirt and preacher's stride, stepped onto the church's front steps and was immediately mobbed by parishioners. He moved with the patient, deliberate grace of a man accustomed to both adulation and danger. Catherine could almost respect it if the man hadn't so efficiently dismantled the region's status quo. She watched as Marcus shook hands, offered hugs, laughed at something a child whispered in his ear. To an outside observer, it might have seemed wholesome, American even. But Catherine saw the threat for what it was. Unity, she believed, was not inherently benign. It was leverage. It was the first wedge in a system that preferred its people to be divided, manageable, and predictable. She lifted the telephoto camera from the passenger seat, the lens cool and heavy in her palm. Through it, she captured a series of stills. Marcus with his arms draped around the shoulders of a white father and black mother, their children cradled between them. Marcus conferring with the Korean patriarch from the back row, each man smiling with a conspiratorial intimacy. Marcus raising his face to the sun, eyes closed as if in prayer. Each click of the shutter drove the images deeper into Catherine's memory, a catalog of evidence she would need for her final report. She set the camera down and reached for her coffee, only to find it had gone cold. The bitterness lingered, acrid on her tongue. She tightened her grip on the cup, knuckles whitening, and set it firmly back in the holder. Across the lot, a group of young people loitered near a battered Civic, arms slung across one another's backs, laughing and jostling as if they'd never known what it was to be afraid of the world. Catherine envied them, in a way, envied their ignorance of the forces that shaped and reshaped the country with each passing year. She remembered her first weeks at the agency, the nervous pride she'd felt wearing the uniform, the sense of order and purpose that came with it. That order felt brittle now, undermined by men like Marcus Whitfield, and, more dangerously, by the myth of Emanuel Bishop. Catherine returned her attention to the dashboard, where the digital recorder continued to log license plate numbers. The car's systems, tuned for subtle surveillance, had logged the arrival and departure of every vehicle since sunrise. She would review the footage later, cross-reference it with agency databases, flag any patterns of concern. For now, it was enough to bear witness. She opened the file folder and reviewed her notes, and eyes scanning for errors or inconsistencies. Each page was a map of the new reality, population shifts, behavioral anomalies, sudden alliances, and dissolutions. 5 years, the agency had said at the beginning. 5 years to manage the fallout of Emanuel Bishop, to contain his influence before it became a contagion. Catherine had thought the timeline generous, but now she saw how quickly things could change when no one was watching. She set the file aside and took another long, deliberate breath. The sweat beaded at her collar, but she ignored it. Instead, she focused on the scene unfolding before her. Marcus Whitfield stood at the edge of the sidewalk now, talking with a young white woman in a headscarf. The woman clutched a Bible and nodded eagerly, her face alight with admiration. Marcus listened, offered a gentle correction, and then shook her hand with both of his. Catherine recognized the gesture, a maneuver of solidarity, a quiet signal that the old lines meant nothing anymore. The sight of it made her jaw clench. She reached for her notebook and scribbled a final line. Recommend escalation of observation. Subject exhibits increasing influence. Traditional containment insufficient. She closed the notebook and smoothed her skirt. Through the glass, she watched the last of the congregation drift away, already forming new constellations of trust and belonging. The world had shifted on its axis, and Catherine Thorne sat alone in the heat, the weight of her assignment settling on her shoulders like a prayer. She started the engine, adjusted the rear view, and drove slowly past the church. Out of habit, she looked for Marcus in the crowd. He saw her, Of course he did, and offered a brief nod. Catherine didn't nod back. She pressed the accelerator and let the old order fall away behind her, wondering how long it would take for the country to become something she no longer recognized. She promised herself, as she turned the corner and disappeared from view, that she would do everything in her power to make sure that day never came.
Stormfront, Book 2 in the God in Black series by Rodney Hamright and Suda Wright, 5 years after God Almighty's first appearance as a black man with dreadlocks, name Emmanuel. His teachings has ignited a cultural upheaval in America. Black churches flourish as they embrace his message of love and unity, drawing multiracial congregations and leading many people to abandon traditional white denominations. Emmanuel continues to appear spontaneously in small towns across the country, spreading his message before vanishing as mysteriously as he arrived. His presence and acceptance of his teachings provoke anxiety among white church leaders and politicians. They fear that if Emmanuel's influence grows, it will lead to widespread demands for the government to end its discriminatory practices against black and brown communities. Get it at RodneyHamrightBooks.com and Amazon, Audible and iTunes, or listen on Apple Podcast.